The American West was once a paradise for wildlife, until it was invaded by an alien species, cattle. Now there's an urgent battle for survival being waged between livestock and wildlife.
Support this Audubon special. GE. From satellites to medical systems, we bring good things to life.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day.
Vast herds of wild animals, at least 10 times the number that now exist, once made these western lands their home, but no longer. Not since the cattle came and took over 400 million acres. 400 million acres of public land. I'm Peter Coyote.
This is Western Range. It looks peaceful enough, but it's at the center of a heated controversy as to whether or not cattle should be allowed to continue to graze on public land.
This is a story about a clash over land that calls to account one of our most cherished myths.
This is where we start growing good beef.
Sure looks good, Tom. Worth coming 2,000 miles for.
Everything a man could want. Good water and grass. Plenty of it.
Who does it belong to?
To me. Someday that'll all be covered with good beef.
And covered it was, until 100 million acres of it were overgrazed and ravaged or turned into desert. These seemingly harmless creatures have become the dominant ecological force in the Western environment. They have had a devastating impact on a remarkably fragile place. Born in Europe and Asia, cattle are well-known culprits in the world, having ruined huge areas on every continent except Antarctica. With human help, cattle have gained competitive advantages over other animals. When they came to North America, cattle began replacing millions of animals which used to live here. 500 years ago, there were 40 to 100 million bison roaming the Great Plains. They were slaughtered for skins and meat and to deprive the Plains Indians of their main food source. They've been displaced by cattle. In the 19th century, 40 to 60 million pronghorn antelope prospered in North America. They were plundered as a food source and then saved from extinction in the early 20th century. They can coexist with cattle, so their numbers have grown. But overgrazing by livestock, along with other human interference, has limited their population to fewer than 1 million, a fraction of their former size. The dry West is made of grasslands, deserts, and mountains. Bighorn sheep cannot live with cattle and seek refuge in the mountains. Once 1 or 2 million strong, now there are only 40,000 bighorns living in remote enclaves under government protection. Elk compete most directly with cattle, sharing much the same selection of plants and grasses. After livestock began arriving from Europe, cattle came to rule the elk pastures. With a limited amount of food and water in the West, the question is, what kind of animals are going to be fed, domestic or wild? The Western Range stretches across 11 states, from New Mexico in the southwest to Montana and Washington in the north. 7 out of every 10 acres of these vast spaces are grazed by livestock. To get an idea of how much public land is involved, consider that the nation of France is about 200 million acres in area. An area twice the size of France is leased for grazing livestock. This is where a vital debate is going on.
One of the biggest problems we have, maybe the biggest environmental problem in the western United States, is also one of the easiest ones to solve, and that is the massive overgrazing that has turned huge areas of which once were rich grasslands into deserts.
Well, I think the principal basis for the conflict is the traditional uses of the early settlers here are now seem to be in conflict with some of the recreational uses that our visitors are discovered they want to do. And of course it is public land and is open to all citizens of the country. So that's what's stirred up most of the debate, is what still should be used, what's the proper use, and how to cut the pie, I guess, so to speak.
After the Civil War, the federal government, trying to lure more settlers to the unpopulated areas, offered homesteads to anybody who would live there. Gradually, livestockmen assumed control of huge stretches of public, government-owned land that were used without regulation or cost. By the 1890s, as many as 26 million cattle were grazing the Western Range. The impact on the range was catastrophic. Cattle have a big appetite. They need 20 pounds of grass to gain a pound. In a year, the average cow eats 10,000 pounds of forage.
In the old days when I was quite young, why, we really fought numbers with numbers because we were competitive against one another, and especially in classes, sheep against cattle. And we were competitive, and the way you handled that was you ran more than the neighbor did, and of course we knew what that was doing to the range. We didn't realize it at the time. Nobody brought it to our attention.
Sheep were also imported to take advantage of the open range. As sheep spread throughout the West, cattlemen complained that they grazed the grass too short, and cattle would not follow where the sheep had gone. Sheepmen were despised and discouraged from competing for the open land.
How can you possibly expect these people who have spent half their lives building up something to just sit by while some outsider comes in and completely ruins the range they fought so hard for?
No, you just wait a minute. Who said anything about completely ruining anything?
Well, I suppose you're going to promise your sheep won't smell and they won't pollute the water holes.
Oh, you are getting awfully hysterical, ma'am. I'm not going to promise anything.
Ever-increasing numbers of sheep poured onto the range. Between 1890 and 1900, there were 40 million sheep annually. Where water is scarce, this is the result. This area around the Rio Puerco was once considered the breadbasket of New Mexico. Grazing thinned out the vegetation. Hooves compacted the surface, allowing water to run off faster, washing away the soil. By the time of the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Rio Puerco area could no longer support itself. The principal town of Cabezon was abandoned. During the week, Dr. Jim Fish is an engineer at Sandia National Laboratory in Albuquerque, New Mexico. But on weekends, he's often found out on the public lands, keeping an eye on the cattle.
What I see out in these rangelands are severely degraded situations where we don't have the vegetation, we don't have the wildlife that ought to be out here because of the overgrazing.
Well, show me here. I mean, I see grass, I see lots of plants. People might say that. What's wrong with this?
Well, for example, this broom snakeweed, an invader species, has no vegetative mass around the base, and so there's nothing to stop erosion compared to the grass, if we can find any out here. There's a nice clump of grass there. You see how much vegetation there is to hold the soil. And you need years for this area to recover from a few years of overgrazing. And this hasn't had a few years of overgrazing. This has decades of overgrazing.
All over the West, cattle are blamed for speeding erosion, which reduces topsoil and dumps silt into rivers and reservoirs.
As the landscape behind me indicates, cattle are an unnatural disaster in this part of the country. They never occurred here. They're an exotic, introduced ungulate with great capacity for destruction. They cannot, in my opinion, be managed in ways that are commercially profitable without this being the result in areas that are especially sensitive, as this obviously is.
So if that's the case, what has the failure of management been that's allowed the range to get degraded?
The way the range was degraded was, most of it was done before 1900s, and it was because we had no regulations as far as grazing, and everything was just a free-for-all. And unfortunately, it bothers me if I get blamed, being a rancher, I get blamed for that, but I wasn't even around. None of my family was around then, and so I didn't do it.
During the drought of the 1930s, the public lands were showing signs of exhaustion. The abuses of the past led to the regulation of grazing on public land. But many people are saying that cattle are still abusing the land, and that now it's time for them to go.
If the cows leave, so do the cowboys and the ranches and the small towns that depend on them, ending a traditional Western way of life.
I grew up on a ranch. I'm a great admirer of cowboys. They're our heroes, our role models, our inspiration. But cowboys have grown up to be cowmen, cattlemen, ranchers, livestock owners. And like the rest of us at the end of the 20th century, some ranchers realize that they've taken a toll on nature, and they're trying to do a better job. Jim Winder, for example, he's a public land rancher in southern New Mexico.
I suppose I've got to be half an idiot to ask you this question, but I didn't notice any bumper stickers on your car that said no more moo in 92 or cow free in 93. Why don't you discuss why people want to get the cows off the range and why you think it's a bad idea?
Well, the people that want all cows removed from the range really don't know all the facts. They blame the damage on the cow, who's just a tool. Grass plants such as these on this range need to be grazed periodically to survive, to be healthy.
Why wouldn't the range just go back to normal if the cows were left off?
It's almost like in your garden. What you're doing is you're planting the seed, you're cultivating, and you're allowing water. You're breaking up where the water goes in better. Plus, the cows spread fertilizer around.
Okay.
And it helps fertilize an area that otherwise would lack in nutrients.
Well, it can't be the cooking. It sure ain't.
Charlie McClure is one of only about 23,000 public land ranchers currently operating under permits from the Bureau of Land Management, the BLM, or the Forest Service. Improving the range is one of the toughest and most thankless jobs around.
Ain't never satisfied. So what am I doing here, Lord?
Okay, my ranch is about 29 sections or 18,500 acres. There's about 12,000 acres of BLM, 6,000 acres of the state, and only about 480 acres of deeded land. I feel like I'm really improving the range. I'm getting many more grass plants and slowing the water flow, the runoff that goes through the ranch. I've slowed it considerably in the last 3 and 4 years.
Staring at the south end of northbound cattle, slaving in the saddle all day. You got to be some kind of natural born fool to want to live your life this way.
Out of 83 million cattle in the country as a whole, only 2 million now graze on public land each year, less than 2% of the national beef production. At the same time, public land ranches are major producers of calves. 1 out of 5 calves born in the United States was born on public lands. The Santa Rita Ranch in southern Arizona is managed by Bill McKibben.
As a rule, you might make money 2 years out of 5 and break even 2 years and maybe lose money 1 or 2 years. It's a fluctuating market, and a lot depends on supply and demand and on imports and on the consumer's demands and their attitudes of the moment, which tend to fluctuate widely.
Public land ranchers currently pay the government grazing fees of $1.97 a month for each cow or cow and calf. Private land averages $10 a month per cow. For every dollar spent by the government to administer the grazing program, it receives only 20 cents in grazing fees.
Most of the ranchers in the Western United States are on welfare, and their welfare is contributed to particularly by United States senators from the West, who often sneer at welfare programs, say, to help poor black kids in Harlem, but are happy to deliver enormous amounts of welfare, larger than any black kid in Harlem ever dreamed of, to already rich ranchers. This should be stopped.
All over the West, small communities have grown dependent on ranching for income. Fewer than 1 out of 6 of all Western ranchers use the public land. But most ranchers stick together, whether they're public or private. At small town auctions, cattle are sold for what the market can bear. Higher grazing fees would put some of them out of business.
What about these little sod busters and these little hard case cowboys and the little small towns that depend on them? What should happen to them, or what will happen to them?
Well, I feel like that they're a dying breed anyway, and I just don't see why we should let them continue to destroy the land, the public land, to support a lifestyle whose time has passed.
Environmentalists' concerns have sharpened at a time when beef is declining in favor among consumers for reasons of both health and expense. It costs about $9 a month to feed these cattle on a feedlot and turn them into beef products. Environmentalists argue that feedlots or eastern states with more rainfall would be better for cattle growing than subsidized public lands. Whether additional beef production should be subsidized is one of the most frequent points of dispute.
Jim, why should we subsidize you? Run your cattle on public land. We're giving you a subsidy. Why should we do that as taxpayers?
I don't ask for any subsidies. There shouldn't be any subsidies at all. I believe that the grazing fees in some areas are too low and they might be too high in some areas. We need to get some method to determine what is a fair market value. That's the difficulty.
What is the true market value of cattle forage for 1 month?
$4 on unit 11.
At a Bureau of Land Management office in Las Cruces, New Mexico, cattlemen are bidding for local allotments of public grazing land. This is the only place in the country where local federal allotments are open for bidding.
Do I have a bid of $4? Number 9 at $4. 405. 5 at 460.
Since each parcel of land is different, the price on each one differs according to the competing bids.
9 at 470.
$4 is the minimum bid for these parcels. The winning bid in this case is more than double the normal fee.
You're looking for a bid of 525. Going once, going twice. Okay, sold at 520, number 8.
There's good land and bad land in the West. More than half the public land, according to the General Accounting Office, is in unsatisfactory condition. And 1/4 of public lands, 100 million acres, are overstocked and declining. Even moderate grazing pressures are compounded by cycles of painful drought, as in this area around Canyonlands in southern Utah.
This is not overgrazing that's caused the condition of this range. It's primarily due to the drought. There are large numbers of perennial grass species and a good diversity of different plants and mixtures out here. But the drought is having significant effects, and we're losing plants because of the drought out here. From the studies and information we've looked at, this is probably the worst and the longest drought we've had since back in the late 1800s, around 1890, 1895.
Well, it's frustrating and somewhat frightening to see a drought start because you have no idea how long it's going to last. A lot of things you can do to cope with the drought for a certain length of time, but the longer it lasts, the more difficult it is to cope. And it just reminds you that Mother Nature is still in charge, and you have to work within her set of rules.
Take these out.
D.L. Taylor is a fifth-generation rancher. Faced with drought, he sold the herd.
We're into the second year of a pretty severe drought, as is most of the southwestern part of the United States. So we plan to restock when the drought is over, perhaps to a smaller level. I'm getting old enough that I don't want to continue to work that hard. I think we'll buy back less cattle than we used to run.
Overgrazing by livestock contributes to the growth of deserts. The deserts of the American Southwest began forming thousands of years ago, but the growth rate is accelerating rapidly. Desert formation tends to be erratic, as seen in this graphic depiction, erupting in the most vulnerable places during times of stress, such as drought and overgrazing. Patches of heavy use, shown in deeper reds, degrade, link up, and spread. There are places in the Southwest where the land has been disturbed by livestock beyond its ability to recover. This is southern New Mexico, near Las Cruces, where the Chihuahuan Desert is advancing over former grasslands. Dr. Jerry Holacek is a range scientist with the New Mexico State University. This land was once covered with hardy native grasses. Dr. Holacek is most offended by debased public lands where the vegetation continues to be overgrazed.
Due to the complete lack of grazable vegetation here and the severe erosion desertification problem that we have, I consider this site completely useless from the standpoint of livestock or wildlife, either one.
A major side effect of grazing is the invasion of shrubs like juniper and pinon. Getting rid of them requires expensive treatments. One way to remove shrubs is by chaining, a method many states no longer practice. This one took place in southeastern Utah. The Bureau of Land Management justifies this activity as a way to restore more natural diversity.
I've lived in southern Utah for 15 years, and I was drawn to this area because it's one of the last places in the United States where you can really find a lot of unspoiled wilderness. So when you see a senseless act like this chaining, it really tears you apart. They chained somewhere between 300 and 400 acres
so that one rancher could increase his grazing allotment for 50 cows for 1 month. And that seems like a lot of destruction for the benefit of one person.
The persistent impact of cattle grazing on wildlife habitat is one of the most crucial issues of the debate. Even animals more adapted to the desert are suffering. Environmentalists blame cattle and overgrazing for the decline of the desert tortoise. Desert tortoises die under the hooves of cattle when they're young and defenseless. In a year, they need only 23 pounds of sparse leaves, less than a cow eats in a day. When range grasses are denuded, desert tortoises starve. Within the growing deserts, the habitat most threatened by cattle are riparian zones, the precious streams and rivers. In Arizona and New Mexico, 80% of endangered species, represented by the red dots, are dependent on riparian zones. Cattle congregate at water sources. Although they can walk a mile or two from water without hardship, this is the kind of place they prefer. The gallery of cottonwood trees is long gone. Since tender young tree saplings are one of their favorite snacks, no new trees grow where cattle are allowed to linger. They like the rich vegetation on stream banks and eventually cause the banks to cave in, contributing to erosion and stream sedimentation. 6 times the biomass is produced along streams where cattle are excluded. Cattle are a major source of water pollution because of what they dislodge from the banks of the streams and from their waste, which often ends up in the streams. The BLM and the Forest Service have given high priorities to the streams and their banks. But according to a General Accounting Office study of 1988, many thousands of miles of these areas, so crucial to fish and wild animals, still need care and protection. The rabbit brush here along the bank is a sign that overgrazing has begun. This is the last remaining above-ground stream near Tucson, Arizona.
If you were a fish, a native fish trying to live in Arizona, you'd have a tough time because these sorts of streams now are almost gone. 100 years of cattle grazing, the erosion that has lowered the land behind me, lowered the water table. The result is that about 23 species of Arizona's native fish are on the endangered list.
Overgrazing complicates other kinds of natural disasters. In an area of heavy grazing, there was a dry summer in 1987, and suddenly, a forest fire. In this complex emergency, one of the most urgent requirements was to rescue an endangered fish, the Gila trout, from one of their few remaining sources. With the fire raging nearby, rescuers worked to salvage enough of the endangered fish to survive the crisis. They succeeded, but only in the nick of time. Grazing impacts had so violated the basin that a heavy rain later flushed ash completely through the system and killed the remaining fish. How many last-minute rescues will be needed in the decades ahead? With a shrinking supply of native grasses, bighorn sheep have found their historic habitats severely restricted by the presence of livestock. Increasingly, they live in the most inaccessible fragments of their former domains. The stress of competing with cattle disposes bighorns to livestock diseases. Harassed by the best of human intentions, they're periodically rounded up to be treated for pneumonia, blue tongue, and scabies mites, communicated by livestock. These healthy animals are being captured to become seed stock in areas where they have died out. Their survival now depends on human intervention.
We have truly an endangered species crisis in the United States. We have between 1,500 and 4,500 species that are either threatened or endangered. Many of those are not yet listed. They're not given protection under the Endangered Species Act. The fact is that from now and into the future, the public lands are going to be the crucial refuge for many of these species and many unthreatened species of wildlife. So what we're looking at is the public lands as the essential vital refuge for wildlife in this country. If we don't protect wildlife there, then where?
Far from enjoying protection, some animals are on a hit list. Prairie dogs thrive in the Southwest, digging their burrows in bare places. Because prairie dogs represent a nuisance for ranchers, they're among the many animals systematically exterminated by an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture called Animal Damage Control. Predators like coyotes are the agency's main target. These were shot from a helicopter one morning. No coyote is safe from the traps and poisons of Animal Damage Control. In 1990, Animal Damage Control spent $29 million to kill over 250,000 animals. And since traps make no distinction, even innocent animals are sometimes caught.
We've had a number of predator problems in Arizona, and I know that this is a controversial issue, but the predators in the last 18 months have really taken a toll on the young calf crop, particularly in the southeastern corner of the state.
In 1989, Animal Damage Control killed 332 mountain lions in the western states. All the mountain lions would probably have been killed by now if they'd been easier to poison.
What are your feelings about the Animal Control Office and their policies and programs?
I think we need to know more about predators and prey and the relationships. This is an extremely important subject. We don't know as much. A lot of times it's a quick fix, and I have used animal damage control out here when I've had a problem, but that problem was a long-term problem and I was using short-term solutions to it. What I'm trying to do is manage where I'm not susceptible to the predators in the time of year that they would be the hungriest or whatever. I'm changing my management policy where I don't need to worry about the predators.
So you'll calve at a time when there's more food for the predators?
Yes, and then try to avoid those areas that are have a higher density of predators. I realize the damage, if we removed a predator, you cannot damage an ecosystem quicker and worse than by removing a predator from it. And my worst problems would be with mice and rats and rabbits. I sure don't want to eliminate anything that's going to control them.
Starting with a natural balanced ecosystem, you bring in these exotic domestic livestock, sheep and cattle, and they start eating the vegetation and competing with the large mammals. The large mammals start declining in numbers, and then the predators that used to feed on the large mammals start feeding on the livestock. Animal damage control comes in and destroys the predators, and then you get the rodents, jackrabbits, prairie dogs start overpopulating. They come in and poison the prairie dogs, and jackrabbits shoot the jackrabbits. And then the predators have even less to feed on, and so they feed more on the livestock, so they do more predator control. So you have this rodent control, predator control, then insect control. Meanwhile, the birds are declining the whole time. And so it's this vicious spiral downward, always wildlife at the expense of these exotic domestic livestock.
done to halt the downward spiral. Better management by the land agencies and greater vigilance in critical environments is a beginning. In the Carson National Forest in northern New Mexico, the Forest Service has brought back an old-fashioned occupation to protect against livestock abuses. Mart Halbert is a range rider.
Well, we're checking the condition of the range for overgrazing, the amount of water. A lot of times in low water conditions, cattle tend to hang around the water holes and they don't get out on the whole grazing allotment. And we check these conditions and let the permittees know so they can come in and drift their cattle back up into some areas where the cattle aren't wanting to stay, to where they utilize the whole range rather than overgrazing one particular spot.
There have been many new schemes devised over the years for better land management. Perhaps the most startling ideas have come from Alan Savory, founder of the Center for Holistic Resource Management. Savory advises ranchers to improve the land with more intensive use of cattle.
Here you can see really in a small area the whole story of a perennial grass that's grown year after year, but because there's been no large herbivores on the land, there's been nothing to convert the annual growth to a smaller bulk for decay, and so the bulk of the grass is just dying as it oxidizes. It's killing the plant. And bear in mind that this bad desertification we're looking at here is protected land.
The holistic process recommends short periods of intensive grazing and a system of rotation which requires careful timing to move the cattle into separate pastures. Intensive management appeals to ranchers by promising to expand their herd size through greater grass production.
What we're doing there is simulating the herd effect of a large herd of animals excited, and we excited them by the opportunity for feed, where in nature they're excited by the opportunity not to get eaten by predators. And so what we're trying to do is apply this herd effect to knock down old senile grass plants and to turn up the soil, cultivate a soil much like somebody would cultivate their garden, and to incorporate the seed and other matter, organic matter into the grass or into the soil. And but basically it just simulates natural processes.
Savory motivates ranchers to intensify their management, but to environmentalists, the idea of even more cattle on the range is unacceptable.
You know, we've heard talk recently about the so-called herd effect, where you get a gazillion critters all running across the land at once, and they trample the seeds, and they break the crust, and they dung, and they urinate, and they do all these wonderful things to the soil. And as a result, things become lush. In fact, that can happen in some cases, in some particular situations, but the idea that these rangelands evolved under massive impacts of massed wildlife is totally out of context with reality.
We now have several studies, about 10 studies from a variety of locations that show that the hoof action effect has either a negative impact or no impact at all compared to, say, moderate continuous grazing or no grazing at all.
With evidence from the New Mexico State University Experimental Ranch, Dr. Holacek's conclusion is that the most cost-effective approach to ranching would come from reducing the grazing levels currently in practice by about 1/3.
This area here is remarkable in that our livestock performance has been as good as some of the better ranges in Texas and in Kansas, and that we've had over 90% calf crops, less than 1% death loss, and about 450-pound calf weaning weights.
Doing more with less, Dr. Holacek believes, the ranchers would be more than compensated by healthier and weightier herds and a healthier range.
So just from a sheer economic standpoint, there's a lot of advantage to sustaining your range in this type of condition rather than taking more forage and having more poisonous plants. the land can be grazed without destroying the land, but at the same time, I think range people and ranchers need to understand that the amount of grazing the land can sustain is probably less than the pressure that we presently have in a lot of these arid areas.
The problem with the current public land grazing system is that all the incentives in the system work to keeping the same number of cattle on the public lands. Right now, there is no incentive to do a better job. The livestock rancher on this side of the fence may be doing an excellent job. The guy on the other side of the fence may be doing a lousy job. They pay the same grazing fee. They get the same grazing permit year after year after year. There is no incentive for the guy who's doing a good job to keep on doing a good job. There's no incentive for the guy doing a bad job to do better.
And quite frankly, the examples doing it right are too far and few between at this point to make the case for continued livestock grazing. I think they should be given a chance, but they should be given some deadlines. There should be goals to be met by the livestock industry and the public land managers, and if they can't make those goals that are in the public interest and rationally picked, they ought to go.
There are reformers like Alan Savory who would like to help ranchers increase their herd size, and those like Dr. Holochek who would like to see moderate grazing. Then there are those who would like to see no public land grazing.
Instead of this creeping improvement that the BLM and the grazing industry is trying to foist onto us as management of the public lands, we'd like to see them just stop all grazing, let the land recover, and then see if we can have some grazing out here. So what we're proposing is get all the livestock off of all of the public lands and evaluate from a position of zero instead of evaluating from a position that we know is too many.
Proponents of removing cattle from the public range must make the case that recovery is possible. Cattle have been excluded for the last 2 years from the Rio Bonito in the Lincoln National Forest in southern New Mexico. These are Earth Day volunteers working to restore or repair an area that was overgrazed and then further damaged by flood. To hasten the recovery process, dead trees are cut and hauled into place to provide shade and cover for fish.
Grab this in now and swing it on around.
We're out here to help the fish to spawn and grow.
When the watercress takes root, it will help keep the soil from washing away. Willows are planted, new trees with a chance to mature without getting eaten by cattle. This is the first step in regeneration, people caring about the future. Another example of a range without cattle is the Pinon Canyon Maneuver Site near Trinidad in southeastern Colorado. Cattle have been excluded from this land for 6 years. In 1984, the U.S. Army removed all the cattle from this public range. The 5th Army Division now uses the land a few times a year for major military maneuvers.
Short 2-1, this is Charlie 6-6, 5 for effect, over.
There were fears in the local community that heavy fighting equipment would take a far worse toll on the land than cattle did. To back up their commitment to protect the land, the Army appointed an environmental officer and gave him the budget and authority to guard against and restore any damages.
Roger, it's a weather advisory 0714. Thunderstorms with 1/4-inch hail and winds variable at speed 50 to 25 knots. How copy?
Got a good copy on you. Be advised it's raining at my location here at Echo. Let's put them in maneuver condition red.
Roger, they're maneuver condition red as of 17:30.
Now what we've got today is we turned it maneuver condition red, which says everybody stops. The importance of that is when you guys stop, you don't damage the land, because you're members of the public and you're part of the stewardship of the public trust.
Outside the maneuver site, on the adjacent land managed by the Forest Service, this is Tom Doherty, who's been surprised by improved conditions on the Army range.
The real paradox is that even though the maneuvers, which most normal people would believe would tear up the dirt and tear up the soil, we're noticing that the vegetative community and that the wildlife community seems to be infinitely better off on the one side of the fence than it is on the other. And the common denominator appears to be livestock grazing.
Almost all the wildlife refuges in the United States permit cattle grazing. The Civieta Wildlife Refuge in central New Mexico is one of the few where cattle are not allowed. Cattle have been excluded since 1973. This is what even arid land can become after 17 years of rest from grazing. On the two sides of the fence, significant changes are beginning to show up.
There are more plant species and animal species here on the ungrazed side of the fence than there would be on the grazed side. The ungrazed areas have more plant materials for animals to feed on, which is basically the base of the food chain. These animals are the ones that are participating in the ecosystem in place of cattle in a lot of cases. It's a value judgment that society will certainly have to make, whether rangelands in the West would be more useful for wildlife, or whether you should continue to try to raise livestock in a marginal situation that is economically unfavorable without some sort of government subsidies.
Good management for an ecologically sound natural system requires increasingly sophisticated information. One of the major projects on the Civieta is the long-term ecological research program, which will measure local environmental changes and their effect on the refuge. These instruments focus infrared light on a mirror in the ungrazed field. The reflected light can be analyzed by computer to identify and measure the gases as they're inhaled and exhaled by the landscape. The grazed and the ungrazed sides are compared.
This landscape really does breathe in the same way that organisms breathe individually. Gases are absorbed on the landscape by the activities of organisms. They're released to the atmosphere by those same organisms. On the other side of the fence, a very different situation. The community is very, very different. It breathes in a very different form. The gases coming off of it also are different. That landscape will allow nitrogen gases to come off. It breathes in a different temporal frequency as well, almost like a panting type comparison as well as compared to maybe a deep, relaxed type breathing on this side of the fence.
Even more disturbing, Dr. Goss has discovered that grazed land gives off greenhouse gases which contribute to global warming, while ungrazed lands tend to absorb them. Cattle have been excluded for more than 20 years on the National Audubon Society's 8,000-acre research ranch near Elgin in southern Arizona. Does the land come back when it is free of cattle? The answer at the research ranch is yes. Carl and Jane Bach have delved into the minute details of this protected environment.
If we look at our grassland and analyze the native grass species, there's nothing new, there's nothing that you couldn't with a bit of hard work find on the surrounding ranches. It's just that the sort of gaps or holes that have filled in with vegetation on our grasslands have been filled in with these native grasses, and they're common here in comparison with our ranching neighbors.
The surrounding cattle ranches here are well managed by thoughtful owners and operators, and they're really not in that bad shape. but they've been grazed essentially continuously for at least 125 years. And you can't have all those cows eating all that grass for all those years without a significant impact. In fact, what we've discovered is that cows are the driving ecological force in these lands. If they're present, they set the rules for what other kinds of plants and animals can occur.
As in the other areas where cattle have been removed, wildlife has returned in abundance, drawn by the protective cover of the tall grasses as well as the diversity of plants. Although we still know very little about ecological processes, slowly researchers are explaining the mysteries of invisible activities. The Bachs are trying to find out why there are only 1/3 the number of grasshoppers on their land compared to the surrounding grazed lands. The answer? Birds. There are more birds on the ungrazed land, and more birds eat more grasshoppers. Where birds are kept out, the grasshopper populations increase to the levels on the grazed side of the fence.
That's the message that we're getting here, is that if you remove cows, things change, and presumably change in a direction that represents their historic condition prior to the introduction of livestock.
Whether cattle can continue their long reign of dominance of the Western Range is an open question. To a large extent, it will depend on the stewardship of the public land ranchers themselves.
You have to take care of the range. We like to think of ourselves as cattle ranchers. In reality, we're grass farmers, and the cattle are just a tool to harvest that grass. And when the ranges are stressed from drought, why, they have to be protected and rested and given some time to recover.
Well, I think we're all responsible. I think the majority of the damage was done before 1900, but it's a slow process in bringing it back. It surely is.
When I die, I'd like to see, all I ask written on my tombstone is he left the land a little bit better place than when he found it.
Some sections of Western Range have recovered to varying degrees from the cattle boom 100 years ago, but large portions remain in critical condition, especially riparian areas and land that continues to be overgrazed. Because public lands are so important for our remaining wildlife, and because they belong to all of us, we should all be concerned about their condition and how they're used.
Those are sandhill cranes that flew in from Idaho and snow geese. A little earlier we saw a whooping crane out here. We're at Bosque del Apache Bird Sanctuary in southern New Mexico, and this is what the Southwest used to be like, this diversity of plant and animal species. When I think of public lands and I think of ranchers, I guess I'm ambivalent, because I like cowboys and I like the way of life. But it's obvious that they're moving themselves toward extinction, and they're moving a lot of species with them. Something has to be done in a hurry. With goodwill and hard work, I think we can preserve the West, preserve the public lands, and preserve something of the ranching way of life for future generations. But without it, I'm afraid the West as we know it is gone. I'm Peter Coyote. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not.
This Autobahn special is made possible by the people of GE. GE, from satellites to medical systems, we bring good things to life. This is PBS.